Almost from the outset of this story, we know that it's going to end badly. After the tenants abused not just one, but two rounds of slaves, we have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen next. We know better than to share the landowner's optimism when he says, "Surely they will respect my son." Jesus' original hearers also knew where this story was headed. They knew it from the moment he said, "There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower." They had heard this setup before, first from the prophet Isaiah, then echoed by the psalmist as we heard earlier. They, like us, knew that things in the vineyard were going to get dark fast. Sometimes things have to get their worst before they have any hope of getting better. The only way out is through. We have a member in our congregation who often lifts up a prayer for all those who suffer addictions, that they may receive the gift of desperation. It is a prayer for people who have been working furiously and blindly at destroying the vineyard that is their own lives. In this parable, it is God's prayer for the tenants who are ultimately their own worst enemies. Maybe if I send my son, they will understand. In this parable, Jesus invites us to witness a train wreck as it is happening. It is hard to look at, especially because we know, as his disciples did, who the landowner's son is. Jesus is talking about his own death. Throughout the Gospels, the disciples protest, arguing with Jesus that this outcome can be prevented, that he can swerve to avoid the fatal collision. But Jesus insists that both aspects of this story are inevitable. On the one hand, God's unflagging efforts to get the attention of the tenants who occupy his vineyard. And on the other, our persistent attempts to follow our own way rather than God's. Where these two realities, God's pursuit of us and our resistance of that pursuit, collide, is at the place we call rock bottom. Jesus calls this rock the stone that the builders rejected. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls. You see, we can only run from God's persistent efforts to get our attention for so long. The vineyard is only so big. Eventually, the natural consequences of our actions catch up to us. Then we must acknowledge the reality we've been working so hard to resist, that we are not the owners of this vineyard. We are only the tenants. Or as the saying goes, the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. The gift of desperation has come to us most dramatically lately in the form of wildfires, the likes of which we've never seen before. They represent the latest sign that the climate reckoning that seemed so far off a decade ago has arrived in our vineyard. During the recent High Holy Days, a rabbi was asked, "I'd like to know why God is letting these things happen." His reply, "Maybe God would like to ask you the same question." The vineyard, after all, was left to us to tend. Our two congregations have recently had the shared experience of partnering with affordable housing developers to transform our own little vineyards into shared residential and worship spaces. I've seen the exciting photos on the Church of the Resurrection Facebook page of the amazing progress being made on the church and on the Spire residential building. This transformation is now visible, But I know for certain that for both of us, the real transformation took place years ago, long before any shovel hit the ground. It happened when we shifted our self-understanding from that of tenants to stewards. As tenants, we were overwhelmed by the burden of buildings in dire need of maintenance. We looked at our spreadsheets and saw a grim trajectory of unsustainability in which we would run out of money or people or both. At some point in our hand-wringing about our limited options, we hit rock bottom. We saw no future except one of inevitable decline facing many mainline churches. And yet, by God's grace, the rock that we hit was the stone the builders rejected, the cornerstone. We could stumble over it, or we could start to rebuild upon it. We realized that our weakness was God's strength. We realized that only when something dies can something new be born. We realized that we were not the owners of our properties, but their stewards, laboring not merely for our own survival, but so that we may return a bountiful harvest to the landowner. Everything we have and everything we are belongs to God. This is the bedrock truth. We are just tending the vineyard on God's behalf. This was the Lord's doing, and it was amazing in our eyes. Jesus does not give us a happy ending in this parable. He does not tell us what the vineyard looks like when it has been restored. That, my friends, is our story to write. He commissioned us to write it when he said, "Greater works than these will you do." The vineyard of our world is ours to tend, and the place is in shambles. It's clear we have work to do to rebuild, to put a new fence around it, unearth the buried wine press, reconstruct the watchtower. But now, having received the gift of desperation, we can approach this task as stewards, no longer under the delusion that we are the owners of this place. Now we may rebuild on the solid rock that cannot be moved, Christ the cornerstone. Now we may follow the Son who was killed and yet who rose again so that we might live and might replant our vineyard on the firm foundation that has been in place since the world began. Now we may, with the Apostle Paul, press on toward the goal for the prize of the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. For there is no better day than today to pick up our shovels and get to work in God's beloved vineyard. Thanks be to God.